She was just a nurse. That's what Dr. Marcus Hargrove told himself as he watched Brooke Sullivan move through the corridors of Sacred Heart Hospital at 2 in the morning. Just a quiet woman in faded scrubs who kept her head down and never made waves. He didn't see the scars that ran like topographical maps beneath her long sleeves, thin white lines that mapped a geography of survival most people would never understand. He didn't see the way her hands moved with the fluid precision of someone trained to work under pressure, each motion efficient and deliberate as a surgeon's. He certainly didn't see the worn pair of combat boots she kept in her locker on the third shelf, polished to a mirror shine every Sunday at 0600 hours, laces tied in a knot only military personnel would recognize. Brooke Sullivan had been working the night shift at Sacred Heart in Raleigh for 3 months. She arrived at 1900 hours and left at 0700, moving through the hospital like a shadow, present but unobtrusive, competent but forgettable. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in a bluish-white glow that made the hospital corridors feel like the inside of a freezer. The smell of antiseptic mixed with floor wax and, underneath it all, the faint metallic tang of blood that never quite washed away completely. She favored her left leg slightly when she walked, a limp so subtle most people never noticed it. Those who did assumed a bad knee or old sports injury. They were wrong about almost everything. When a code blue alarm sounded on the 4th floor at 0247 hours, Brooke moved toward it before the overhead speakers finished announcing the location. She didn't run. She didn't hesitate. Her feet carried her in a direction that felt instinctive, muscle memory activated by a sound that meant someone's heart had stopped. By the time she reached the ICU, her mind had already shifted into a different frequency, the one that had kept her and her teammates alive through 3 tours in Helmand Province. Time became measured in heartbeats and breaths. Urgency became information. Dr. Marcus Hargrove was not in the code blue. He was in his office on the 3rd floor, pulling up billing records on a computer screen that glowed like a confession. Hargrove was 47 years old, the kind of handsome that came from expensive dentistry and a tanning salon membership. He wore tailored suits even to the hospital and drove a black Mercedes that cost more than most nurses made in a year. His practice was built on a reputation for efficiency and results, the sort of doctor other doctors referred their most complicated cases to. What nobody knew was that his reputation was built on a foundation of carefully constructed fraud. For 18 months, Hargrove had been billing insurance companies for procedures that were never performed. A spinal fusion here, an exploratory laparotomy there, procedures coded with careful precision and submitted through a network of shell companies that funneled the payments into offshore accounts. The scheme was elegant in its simplicity. The money was staggering. $847,000 in the past year alone. In another 18 months, he would have enough to retire completely, to disappear into a life of golf courses and beach houses where nobody asked questions about where the money came from. But something had changed 3 months ago. Something named Brooke Sullivan. Hargrove had watched her work. That was the problem. He'd observed her charting medications in the fluorescent-lit corridor outside the ICU at 0312 hours, her handwriting precise as a military report, each letter formed with the kind of deliberate care that suggested someone for whom documentation was not just habit but principle. She'd worked a double shift in the unit last week, 16 hours straight, and her notes were flawless. Not just competent. Flawless. Every medication logged with timestamp and dosage. Every procedure documented with the kind of detail that suggested she understood that her writing was not just a record, it was a legal document. More troubling was what her charts revealed about his own documentation. Or rather, what they revealed by contrast. Where Brooke's notes were meticulous, his were sparse. Where she documented every detail, he documented only outcomes. Where she recorded the procedures she'd actually performed, he recorded procedures that existed only in the billing codes. It was the difference between a work of art and a forgery. You could spot the fake if you knew what to look for. Brooke Sullivan knew what to look for. The night before, Hargrove had pulled her personnel file at 0237 hours. The references were spotless. The timeline was solid. But there were gaps. 14 months where she'd apparently been unavailable for employment. 7 months before that with no listed address. Her social security number checked out, but her employment history had the carefully constructed feel of a document that had been rebuilt. Not illegal. Not quite. Just prepared by someone who understood how to construct a narrative that would survive scrutiny without inviting closer examination. He made his decision that night. Brooke Sullivan had to go. The next morning, Hargrove approached her in the medication room at 06 for 5 hours, just as she was preparing to clock out. The medication room was small, lined with drawers of narcotics and ampules organized by protocol. The smell of rubbing alcohol hung in the air like a chemical fog. Hargrove entered with a smile that looked genuine if you didn't look at his eyes. His eyes were calculating the angle of approach like a man who understood the geometry of intimidation. "Brooke," he said, his voice smooth as syrup. "How are the night shifts treating you?" "They're manageable, doctor." She didn't look up from the narcotic log she was reviewing. Her pen moved across the page with the same precision her hands used for everything else. "You know, I've noticed you've been putting in some serious hours. Double shifts. Perfect attendance." He leaned against the counter, positioned himself between her and the door in a way that was probably accidental. "Probably. I'm wondering if the pace might be catching up with you. Night shift can be brutal." "I'm fine, doctor." "I'm sure you are. But I'm thinking maybe you'd be happier somewhere else. Different schedule. Day shift somewhere. A clinic, maybe. Somewhere less intense." He smiled again, and this time it showed his teeth. "I'd be happy to make some calls. Help you find the right fit." Brooke finished writing the final entry in the narcotic log. Her handwriting didn't waver. She recapped her pen with a soft click, the only sound in the medication room besides the hum of the climate control system. When she finally looked at him, her eyes were the color of October, dark and flat and giving nothing away. "I like the night shift, doctor," she said. "I'm effective here." "That's just it, though. You're too effective. Makes other staff members uncomfortable. The residents especially. They feel like they're being evaluated every time you walk past them." He moved closer, his cologne arriving before his body did, something expensive that smelled like cedar and arrogance. "I'm trying to do you a favor here, Brooke. Take it gracefully." She didn't respond. She simply set the narcotic log in its designated slot and walked past him toward the medication room door. Her shoulder didn't touch his, but she didn't deviate her path for him either. She moved through the space he occupied with the calm certainty of someone who had navigated far more dangerous terrain than a hallway and a doctor's wounded ego. In her locker on the third shelf, hidden beneath spare scrubs and a yoga mat she never used, the combat boots remained. They were old, issued in 2004, broken in through 3 tours across a landscape that most Americans only saw in news footage. The leather had faded from its original tan to a color that looked like old bone. The laces were worn and frayed at the edges. She'd polished them yesterday, Sunday at 0600 hours, using a soft cloth and saddle soap and a muscle memory that refused to be filed away as history. The boots had carried her through Helmand province. They'd carried her 6 miles through enemy fire with a child on her back. They'd carried her to gravesites and through airports and into a life where nobody knew her name. What Hargrove didn't know was that the man on the ICU monitor whose heart had restarted at 02 for 9 hours would be transferred to his ward later that week. What Hargrove didn't know was that the transfer order would come with a name that would connect to a file that had been sealed by the Pentagon. What Hargrove didn't know was that his carefully constructed threat to remove Brooke Sullivan from his sphere of influence would become the first move in a sequence of events that would end not with her resignation, but with the complete disassembly of his entire life. But that wasn't the worst part for him. The worst part was that she'd already seen through him. Brooke had noticed his billing discrepancies 3 weeks ago. She'd noticed the procedures coded but not documented in her observations. She'd noticed the pattern in his charting that suggested someone constructing a narrative rather than recording reality. She hadn't reported him yet. She'd done what she always did, she'd waited. She'd observed. She'd gathered information like a soldier behind enemy lines, patient and thorough and preparing for a fight that was coming whether Dr. Marcus Hargrove knew it or not. The fluorescent lights hummed above her as she clocked out. Rain had started outside, a soft percussion against the hospital windows that sounded almost like distant helicopters. She stood in the parking lot for exactly 3 seconds, the morning air cold against her face, her badge hanging heavy around her neck. In her pocket, her phone carried a number that hadn't rung in 7 years. A number that would be called exactly once, when everything else failed. A number that would change everything. For now, she was just a nurse. But dawn was breaking over Raleigh, and the story was just beginning to turn. The room went dead silent. Dr. Marcus Hargrove stood at the center of the cafeteria at Sacred Heart Hospital, his tailored blazer catching the fluorescent glare, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of a man who'd never been told no. Around him, the day shift staff clustered near the vending machines and lunch tables, nurses in scrubs, residents in their white coats, administrative staff who'd wandered in for coffee. Brooke Sullivan stood near the back, still in the dark blue scrub she'd worn through the night shift, the fabric slightly wrinkled from 6 hours of running codes and charting. Her combat boots were laced tight beneath the scrubs, invisible to everyone around her. Hargrove smiled, the kind of smile that preceded a punch disguised as a joke. "I'm making a friendly wager," he announced, his voice pitched for maximum projection. "I bet our little night mouse here quits within a week. Any takers?" He gestured toward Brooke without looking directly at her, as if she were a curiosity in a display case. She's clearly not cut out for this environment. Too quiet. Too meticulous. The kind of personality that doesn't fit. Laughter rippled through the cafeteria, not everyone joining, but enough to create that sickening wave of social permission. A third-year resident near the coffee station chuckled nervously. A floor supervisor smiled in that thin, uncertain way that suggested she'd made a mental note to distance herself from whatever was about to unfold. Brooke took one measured breath. Her hands remained at her sides, palms open, fingers relaxed. She'd been trained to recognize threat escalation, the micro-expressions, the postural shifts, the way a room's energy changed when a predator identified wounded prey. This was textbook stage 1 humiliation. Social dominance display. Hargrove establishing hierarchy in front of witnesses, building the narrative that she didn't belong. A single tear formed at the corner of her left eye, unbidden, the kind of physiological response that happens when you've absorbed weeks of low-level psychological pressure without breaking. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Hargrove. Said nothing. Just met his gaze with the kind of stillness that came from having spent 18 months in a forward operating base where silence could mean survival. Hargrove's smile widened. He'd misread the tear as surrender. 3 days later, the cafeteria filled with the lunch crowd again. The smell of reheated chicken, canned vegetables, and industrial-grade disinfectant hung in the air like a persistent accusation. Brooke carried her tray past the doctor's table where Hargrove held court, a sandwich she wouldn't eat, black coffee she'd need for the rest of her shift, a yogurt she'd been forgetting to touch. Her patient charts from the night shift were stacked on a nearby counter, organized by room number, each one notated with the precision that comes from someone who understands that documentation is either your shield or your weapon. Hargrove stood abruptly. Not aggressively at first, just a man rising to greet someone. He stepped directly into her path. The cafeteria chatter continued for another half-second before people registered what was about to happen. A few voices trailed off. Phone conversations paused. And then Hargrove's arm came up, a sharp upward motion, knocking the tray from her hands with the casual violence of someone who'd calculated there would be no consequences. Coffee splattered across the white tile in a dark bloom. The sandwich tumbled. The yogurt hit the floor and burst open. The cafeteria went silent, not the polite silence of people trying not to stare, but the heavy, electric silence of witnesses to something that had crossed a line. He grabbed her patient charts from the counter beside her, weeks of meticulous documentation, each one a record of her competence, and threw them at her feet. Pages scattered across the tile like leaves. Some slid under nearby tables. A few drifted through the air before settling. His voice dropped to that low, dangerous register that carries without shouting. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he sneered, each word a blade. Maybe if you spent less time on paperwork and more time learning your place, you'd last longer here. He turned back to his table like the conversation was finished. Like she wasn't a human being standing in front of 40 witnesses. Like this was how the world worked: the strong humiliated the weak, and the weak accepted it. Brooke took one measured breath. Her jaw tightened, just slightly, the only visible tension in her entire body. One tear escaped, tracking down her right cheek, and she wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Hargrove's back. She knelt slowly, gathered the charts with deliberate care, stacking them in order, checking each page for damage. The room remained silent except for the hum of the refrigerators and the distant beeping of a monitor from the adjacent hallway. Then she stood. Her voice, when it came, was quiet enough that people had to lean in to hear it. Quiet enough that it sounded dangerous. Quiet enough that it sounded like it came from somewhere deeper than a voice box, like it came from the part of her that had survived things no nurse should have to survive. "I've been knocked down by better men than you, doctor," she said, her voice like steel wrapped in silk, "and I'm still standing." Hargrove's shoulders went rigid. He didn't turn around. The cafeteria remained utterly silent for 3 seconds. Then the ambient noise of the hospital resumed, conversations restarting, phones ringing in the distance, the ordinary sounds of a Tuesday lunch, but something had shifted. Hargrove had expected submission. He'd gotten something else entirely. That night, Brooke found her locker vandalized. The pair of worn combat boots she kept in the bottom, the ones she'd carried through deployments and into civilian life, were pulled out and thrown in the trash bin beside her locker. Her personal photographs, 2 of them, careful and sparse, were torn in half. A note was taped inside the locker in handwriting that didn't match anyone on staff: "Tick-tock, sweetheart." She retrieved the boots without changing her expression, cleaned them methodically with a paper towel and water from the bathroom sink, and returned them to the bottom of her locker in exactly the same position. The next morning, Hargrove called her into his office. His desk was organized with surgical precision, pens aligned, papers squared, a framed photo of him receiving an award from some hospital board member. He gestured for her to sit, and before she could settle into the chair, he'd already begun writing. "Defensive attitude toward constructive feedback," he said aloud as he wrote, his voice carrying the tone of someone documenting a diagnosis. "Failure to accept coaching from senior physicians. Insubordination masked as professionalism." He wrote 3 copies of the write-up, filed them in her personnel folder, and slid one across the desk toward her. "This is stage 1 documentation," he said, his voice smooth, conversational. "Do you understand what that means?" He didn't wait for an answer. "It means there's a paper trail now. Next incident, it's stage 2. Stage 2 leads to termination. You have the choice, Nurse Sullivan. You can resign with dignity, or I can ensure that no hospital in North Carolina will hire you again." He smiled that thin, calculated smile. "Your move." Brooke took the write-up without comment. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was even. Her eyes were empty of emotion. She turned and walked out of his office, and behind her, Hargrove was already making mental calculations about accelerating the timeline. Forcing her out slowly was becoming tedious. He needed her gone faster, and he had the connections to make it happen. 3 board members owed him favors. A state investigator he'd testified for in a malpractice case. The infrastructure of institutional power was his to activate, and he'd already begun considering how to dismantle her credentials entirely. But that wasn't the worst part. At 0200 hours on a Tuesday, everything accelerated. The ER doors crashed open with the kind of violence that comes from paramedics running a hot load. Brooke was 3 hours into her night shift, moving through the patient census with the efficient silence that had become her default. The sound of the doors hitting the stops echoed through the trauma bay, a metal on metal, sharp and definitive. Paramedics wheeled in a gurney at full speed. The patient was coded as John Doe, male, approximately 40 years old, severe respiratory distress, blood pressure tanking. The patient wore civilian clothes, jeans, a dark flannel shirt, but his haircut was too precise, too deliberate. The way his fingers gripped the metal rail of the gurney despite the agony in his face spoke of someone trained to maintain control under stress. A tattoo was partially visible beneath his rolled-up sleeve, ink that looked military. Dr. Chen, the attending physician, was already barking orders. Get vitals. What's his oxygen saturation? Get an EKG going. Looks like MI. The paramedic gave rapid-fire report, found him on the side of Route 540, unresponsive but responsive to voice. Accelerated respiratory rate. Chest pain. No known medical history, no identification. Chen nodded, his mind already running the algorithm. Cardiac infarction. Myocardial infarction. Get him to the catheterization lab. Standard protocol. Brooke was assigned to triage. She stepped closer to the patient's bedside, her movements fluid, her assessment automatic. Her eyes catalogued details, the patient's neck veins distended, jugular venous pressure elevated enough to see from 2 feet away. His trachea deviated slightly to the left, a subtle shift in the anatomy of his neck that meant his airway was being compressed from one side. Breath sounds absent on the right side of his chest. The kind of presentation she'd seen in Helm and Province a dozen times. Young men with shrapnel in their lungs. Collapsed lung tissue. Air trapped in the thoracic cavity, pressure building, pushing against the heart. Doctor, she said quietly, her voice not urgent, not panicked, just stating fact, I think it's tension pneumothorax. Chen didn't even look at her. Heart attack protocol, Nurse Sullivan. Get him to cath lab. And that's when Brooke's eyes actually focused on the patient's face. Her hands trembled, just once, just slightly, a betrayal of every lesson she'd learned about maintaining composure under pressure. 20 years melted away. The same eyes. The same scar on his left eyebrow, the thin white line where she'd used tweezers to pick out shrapnel in a burning village while rockets landed 300 meters away. The 8-year-old boy she'd carried 6 miles through enemy fire, moving only at night, staying in shadow, her hands pressing a field dressing to his arm while he stayed silent, brave beyond measure. Now a grown man. Now a captain. Now dying in front of her in a hospital in Raleigh, North Carolina, where he wasn't supposed to exist and neither was she. Captain James Morrison's oxygen saturation dropped to 78%. The monitor beeped once. Twice. Then accelerated. The ambulance doors burst open at 0200 hours. Paramedics rolled a stretcher through the ER entrance with the controlled urgency of men who'd seen this exact sequence 1,000 times before. The patient was coded as John Doe, a male, approximately 40, skin the color of concrete, breathing like a man drowning in air. His chest heaved with each desperate inhalation, but nothing was getting in, nothing was moving through. The monitor showed tachycardia screaming at 142 beats per minute. Blood pressure dropping. 67/39 and falling. John Doe, unresponsive, found unresponsive at a motel off Route 40, severe respiratory distress, 2 failed attempts at establishing for access in the field, the paramedic called out, matching the stretcher's pace as they crashed through the trauma bay doors. We've got shallow respirations, absent breath sounds on the right, what looks like cardiac compromise, getting him to you now. The ER team moved like water flowing around stone. Dr. Chen, the resident, grabbed the patient's chart as they wheeled him into Bay 3. Nurses clipped monitors to his chest, the lead snapping against his skin with the quick precision of ritual. The ventilator began its mechanical wheeze, a sound like a machine trying to breathe for someone who'd forgotten how. Get me a 12 lead, now, Chen ordered. And set up for STEMI protocol. This looks like acute MI. The attending physician, Dr. Patterson, was already moving, a man with silver temples and the kind of confidence that came from 23 years of being right. He leaned in, stethoscope cold against John Doe's chest, listening to the story his lungs were telling. Except they weren't telling the right story. They were screaming a completely different diagnosis, and nobody in the room was hearing it. Blood pressure, 65/38. Dropping. Brooke had been 3 steps into the bay when the patient arrived, her scanner already showing the vital sign trend. She moved toward the stretcher, eyes tracking the monitors, her hands moving through habit and training so ingrained it felt like breathing. That's when she heard it. What she didn't hear. The absence of breath sounds on the right side of his chest, not diminished, not decreased, completely absent. Unilateral silence. Trachea shifted slightly left. Neck veins distended like they might burst through the skin. Hypertension that wouldn't respond to stimulus. The second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Tension pneumothorax. He's in VTAC, Chen announced, staring at the monitor. Prep for defibrillation. Patterson nodded, moving with the certainty of a man about to save a life using all the wrong tools. Charge to 360. Brooke stepped closer. Her voice came out quiet, controlled, the voice of someone who'd delivered far worse news to far more dangerous men than these residents would ever meet. It's not his heart. Excuse me. Patterson didn't look away from the monitor. Unilateral breath sounds absent, tracheal deviation, hypertension unresponsive to stimulus. He's got a tension pneumothorax. Right side. Chen glanced at her like she'd just suggested they treat him with prayer and honey. Nurse Sullivan, the EKG clearly shows. The EKG shows what happens when a collapsed lung compresses the heart. We're running out of time. Patterson's expression shifted. Not agreement, not yet. Something closer to the irritation of being questioned by someone whose job was to hand him instruments, not diagnose. Thank you, Nurse Sullivan, we have this under control. Brooke didn't move. Her hands were already reaching for the crash cart, muscle memory pulling her toward the trauma shears, the gauze, the sterile field she knew like her own skin. 12 years of combat medicine. 3 tours through Helmand Province. 2,000 procedures in places where you didn't get a second chance because there was no backup, no attending physician, no defibrillator that worked when bullets had shredded the power supply. Just your hands and your judgment and the knowledge that every second the patient wasn't breathing was a second they'd never get back. Blood pressure, 62/35. He's not perfusing, she said. You get one more cycle. After that, his heart stops from lack of oxygen, not from arrhythmia. Patterson's jaw tightened. He was a good doctor. 12 years of experience, double board certification, the kind of physician who belonged in a trauma bay. But he'd never been to Helmand Province. He'd never treated a patient in a cave with nothing but a field dressing and muscle memory because the nearest hospital was 6 hours and 7,000 feet of elevation away. He'd never learned to listen to what the body was screaming rather than what the machines were singing. Defibrillate, Patterson said. The paddles came out. Brooke moved. She didn't ask permission. Didn't request authorization. Didn't follow the hierarchy that said residents order nurses and nurses follow orders like they're written on stone tablets. She grabbed a 14-gauge angiocath needle from the crash cart, her movements the fluid precision of apex predators, swift, certain, incapable of hesitation. The needle was already in her hand, already finding the landmarks her fingers had memorized 2 decades ago. Right side. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. Her left hand found his ribs like a musician finding the strings of an instrument they'd played their entire lives. Nurse Sullivan, stand down, Hargrove's voice cut through the bay like a blade. He was standing in the doorway, watching, his expression shifting from confident to calculating in the space of a single heartbeat. Brooke inserted the needle. The hiss of escaping air was the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard in a hospital. Not the ventilator's mechanical wheeze. Not the heart monitor's steady beep. The sound of pressure releasing, of a collapsed lung finally getting room to breathe again. The sound of 40 years of experience forcing its way through 23 years of denial. Morrison gasped. His oxygen saturation climbed like someone was pulling it upward with a rope. 95, 98. His color went from the gray of dying to the pale pink of living. His pupils, which had been dilated from oxygen deprivation, started to contract. The blood pressure monitor read 84/52. Still low, still critical, but climbing. Perfusion returning. Life returning. A man coming back from the edge of the void. The room fell so quiet you could hear the rain hammering the ER bay doors outside, each drop hitting the reinforced glass like static on a dead channel. "Get me a chest tube kit," Brooke said. "Smaller bore, 28 French, and prep his right anterior axillary line. We need to stabilize this before his other lung collapses." Nobody moved. They were frozen, every resident and nurse in that bay, staring at the woman in scrubs who'd just performed a procedure that wasn't in her job description, that belonged to physicians, that senior nurses didn't do without authorization, without orders, without the explicit permission of someone with an MD after their name. Patterson was the first to recover. He looked at the monitors, then at the needle still in Morrison's chest, then at Brooke's face, which was empty of apology, empty of uncertainty, full of the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst thing that can happen to a human being. "Get me a tube kit," he said quietly. "She's right." But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't the moment that changed everything. Morrison's eyes opened. Consciousness surfacing like a man breaking through water after holding his breath too long. His gaze found Brooke's face, and something in his expression shifted. Not confusion. Not the standard acknowledgement of the person who'd just saved your life. Something deeper. Something that looked like memory. Like recognition trying to surface through the fog of sedation and adrenaline and the raw shock of being one breath away from death. His lips moved. No sound came out. But his eyes held hers, and in that single look was 20 years of silence and a single word that never made it past his throat: "Angel." Hargrove watched from the doorway. His expression went white, then red, then settled into something colder and more calculated than either. He'd come to the ER at 0200 to observe the new trauma admission, a routine check he did twice a week. He'd come expecting to see Brooke perform her job with quiet competence, the way she did everything. Instead, he'd watched her break protocol, override physician orders, and perform a procedure that should have gotten her fired on the spot. Except it had saved a man's life. Except she'd been right. Except everyone in that bay now knew that Nurse Brooke Sullivan wasn't just another night shift nurse. She was something else entirely. Something that didn't fit into the neat hierarchy of a hospital. Something that couldn't be managed with public humiliation or board pressure or any of the tools Hargrove had been collecting for weeks. He stepped back into the corridor, his phone already in his hand. He made the first call at 0217. Dr. Reeves answered on the second ring, a man who'd approved fraudulent billing codes in exchange for a quiet $50,000 a year routed through shell companies. "We have a problem," Hargrove said. "Brooke Sullivan just performed a needle decompression without physician authorization. She overrode my direct orders." The second call came at 0234. Linda Thornton, board member, the same woman whose son's DUI arrest had been quietly erased from the public record 3 years ago through connections Hargrove had cultivated. "I need your help removing a nurse. Tonight." The third call at 0248 was to the state medical board investigator he'd been grooming for 6 months, the one who'd already agreed to look into credential discrepancies for the right price. The references she provided might not hold up to scrutiny. Especially the military service. "Want me to send them over?" The fourth call at 0301 was to Starfreight Agency, the employment contractor that had handled Brooke's initial hiring. The same contractor that held her reference documentation. The references that were part of a cover story constructed by military intelligence 2 decades ago, never intended to withstand serious scrutiny, hastily built from borrowed pieces of other people's lives because Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan had stopped existing the day she was ordered into deep cover. By dawn, her security badge was deactivated. By afternoon, an investigator arrived at Sacred Heart with a warrant to search her locker. By evening, Brooke Sullivan stood in the break room as the investigator pulled out her worn combat boots, the same boots she'd worn through 3 tours of Helmand Province, the sole scuffed and the laces frayed, the left boot still holding the faint imprint of shrapnel from an IED that had killed 3 men standing next to her but had only grazed her calf. "These are military issue," the investigator said. Brooke said nothing. Didn't move. Didn't flinch. "Your employment application states you've never served in the military." Still nothing. The composure of someone who'd learned long ago that words were weapons and silence was armor. You're suspended pending investigation for credential fraud and practicing beyond your scope of licensure. You're to surrender your hospital identification immediately. You're not to return to Sacred Heart until the investigation is complete. The investigator left at 18:47 hours. Brooke stood alone in the break room, holding her deactivated badge in one hand, watching the fluorescent lights buzz above her head. Outside, the evening had turned to night. Rain was starting to fall, the kind of rain that sounded like applause on the windows. She had no idea that in Bay 3, Captain James Morrison, the boy she'd pulled from a burning village 20 years ago, the child she'd carried through enemy fire for 6 miles in the dark, the life she'd saved twice now, was already awake enough to ask questions. Or that he was already picking up his secure phone. Or that the single call he was about to make would set in motion an event that would bring the entire weight of military command down on Sacred Heart like judgment from above. Dr. Hargrove's hands trembled as he sat in his office at 1,430 hours, the weight of what he'd just witnessed still settling into his bones. Brooke Sullivan. Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan. Navy Cross. 2 silver stars. For Purple Hearts. The words replayed in his mind like a broken record, each repetition making his chest tighter, his breathing shallower. He'd been so careful. 20 years of fraud, of billing schemes that funneled hundreds of thousands into offshore accounts in the Caymans. He'd built a network, board members, administrators, insurance adjusters, all of them feeding at the same trough, all of them complicit. And then she'd walked into his hospital. But Hargrove hadn't gotten this far by panicking. He'd gotten here by acting. By moving first. By understanding that institutions protect themselves, and that the people running them were fundamentally corruptible. That morning, before the Taliban commander had started shouting in the corridor, before Morrison had appeared in his hospital gown, before the Navy uniforms had filled the lobby like an invading force, Hargrove had already activated his insurance policy. He'd already made his calls. At 0800 hours, while Brooke was still standing in the rain at her husband's grave, Hargrove had been on the phone with the 3 board members whose offshore accounts had benefited most from his fraud scheme. Board member Castellano owned a $2.4 million house on the coast. Board member Pierce had just purchased a yacht. Board member Bennett's daughter was about to start at Princeton, Jewish and fully paid. They answered his calls at the first ring. Problem, he'd said simply. The nurse who saved Morrison. She's not who she says she is. But her credential fraud is documented. Security already searched her locker. Evidence is in the system. The lie came smooth as silk. We need to move fast. File the incident reports today. Now. Before anyone can connect the dots. They understood what he wasn't saying. Their entire empire rested on keeping her quiet, on destroying her credibility, on making sure nobody ever believed anything she said about his billing practices. At 0830 hours, he'd made the second set of calls to the references on her personnel file. He had her social security number, her hire date, her formal education claims. The nursing school in Fort Bragg. The 6 years of civilian medical experience listed on her resume. All of it fabricated, all of it designed to hide who she really was. But Hargrove had hired investigators before. He knew how to weaponize paperwork. I'm calling to verify employment history, he told the woman who picked up at the reference number. Brooke Sullivan, 3 years at your facility. The woman had sounded confused. We don't have any record of that person. He'd hung up and called the next number. Same result. Same confusion. Perfect. Documentation of fraud. Evidence that could be printed, photographed, filed with the State Medical Board. By 0900 hours, before he'd even finished his morning coffee, Hargrove had already contacted Dr. Raymond Toth, the outside investigator from the North Carolina Medical Board. He'd done it before, called in favors, paid the appropriate consultation fees, guided investigations toward predetermined conclusions. I need an urgent review of credential documentation for a staff nurse, he'd said, his voice carrying the appropriate concern of a responsible physician. The paperwork appears to be falsified. The references don't check out. And this morning, she performed a needle decompression procedure without physician authorization. That's practicing medicine without a license. The investigator had assured him a formal letter would be drafted by afternoon. At 1000 hours, hospital security had escorted Brooke to her locker while she was still in her scrubs. Standard procedure during investigation, the security director had said, his voice neutral but his hands already gloved, his camera already raised. Everything photographed. The worn combat boots, the one she'd kept at the bottom of the locker for 3 months, photographed and labeled as evidence. Evidence of what? Brooke had asked, her voice steady, but the security director hadn't answered. He didn't need to. They both knew. By 1100 hours, her badge had been deactivated. By 1130 hours, a letter of immediate suspension had been placed in her personnel file. By 1200 hours, the medical board investigator had called with formal notification she was prohibited from performing any nursing duties pending a full hearing regarding credential fraud and scope of practice violations. Hargrove had been so pleased with himself. So certain that he'd moved fast enough, that he'd controlled the narrative, that he'd buried her under enough paperwork and procedure and institutional inertia that the truth, whatever truth there was, would never surface. Then the elevator doors had opened. Now, sitting in his office with the door locked, Hargrove understood that he'd miscalculated on a scale so profound that his entire understanding of power had been rendered obsolete. There was institutional power, the kind he'd spent 20 years building. And then there was the power of the federal government when it decided to move. Those were not the same category of thing. He heard footsteps in the corridor outside his office. He heard voices. Official voices. He heard the words Dr. Marcus Hargrove and federal investigation and healthcare fraud, and his hands went numb. The knocking on his office door came at 1445 hours. Not a request. A command delivered through solid oak. Hargrove stood, smoothed his white coat, and opened it to find an FBI agent in a dark suit, flanked by 2 uniformed officers from the Raleigh Police Department, their badges catching the fluorescent light overhead with cold reflection. Dr. Hargrove, the FBI agent said, his voice carrying the weight of institution so much larger than Sacred Heart, so much larger than Hargrove's carefully constructed network, you're under arrest for healthcare fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The handcuffs were stainless steel, cold against Hargrove's wrists. They made a soft metallic click, a sound like a door closing on his entire life. Meanwhile, in the ICU, Morrison was being gently guided back to his bed by a Navy corpsman who moved with the efficient precision of someone who'd performed the same action 1,000 times in 1,000 different locations. "Easy, Captain," the corpsman said. "You're still healing." Morrison's eyes were locked on the corridor beyond the open door, watching the space where Brooke had stood moments before. She was gone now. Back up to the 3rd floor, back to the security office, back to gathering the pieces of a life that had been shattered in 18 hours. But Morrison had seen her face. Had seen the moment when she understood that the silence she'd maintained for 2 decades was finally breaking. Had seen the trembling in her hands when she held the declassified file, not trembling from fear, but from the sheer overwhelming reality of standing in the light after 20 years in shadow. He'd made the call because it was the only thing he could do. Because she'd saved his life once when he was 8 years old, carrying him through fire and blood and the screaming of dying men. Because she'd done it again at 0200 hours this morning, her hand steady, her diagnosis certain, her willingness to act without authorization flowing from something deeper than fear of consequences. In the parking lot, the black SUV that had been following Brooke since she left the hospital that morning was no longer needed. The tail had been called off at 1410 hours by order of command authority that traced back through JSOC to the Pentagon itself. She was no longer a person of interest in a surveillance operation. She was a person of extreme value to the national security apparatus that had ordered her into the darkness 20 years ago. By 1800 hours, as evening rain began to fall across Raleigh in thick grey sheets, Brooke stood in the parking lot of a federal building downtown, her jacket soaked, her face unreadable. A Navy attorney stood beside her, a folder in his hands. "The investigation into the credential fraud charges is being terminated immediately," the attorney said. "At federal level. The medical board has already been notified. Your license is being retroactively protected under the Medical Reserve Corps statute. You were operating under direct orders from a classified operation. Everything is being made retroactively legal." Brooke didn't respond. She was looking at something the attorney couldn't see, some internal calculus, some weighing of 20 years against one night, some reckoning with the fact that the life she'd built, the nurse she'd become, was now exposed as a cover story that had somehow become true. "There's more," the attorney said. "Command wants to talk about active duty status. About bringing you back officially." "About?" "No," Brooke said, her voice like a door closing. "I'm done. I'm a nurse. That's what I am now." The attorney looked like he wanted to argue. But something in her tone stopped him. Something in the way she stood in the rain, shoulders back, chin level, a woman who'd already made her choice and wouldn't be unmade. The rain hammered the pavement around them like distant gunfire, like applause, like the sound of 20 years finally coming to an end. The rain had stopped by the time the transferred patient arrived at Sacred Heart. A former Taliban commander, granted asylum in exchange for intelligence cooperation with the Defense Intelligence Agency, was being moved from the VA Medical Center in Durham for specialized cardiac care. Security cleared the third floor. 2 federal marshals flanked his room. Nobody knew his name. Nobody needed to. Brooke was restocking the med cart when she heard the shouting. Not English. Pashto, thick and urgent, pouring from room 312 like a dam breaking. She froze. Her hands knew that language the way muscle memory knows a weapon. The marshal's hand went to his belt. Other nurses scattered. Then she heard her name. Not Brooke. Not Nurse Sullivan. A name that had been erased for 20 years, spoken in a voice that had last heard it in a village that officially didn't exist. The Angel of Helmand. "She is the one who held the mountain for 3 days." The man's voice cracked on the final word. Through the doorway, she could see him, older now, grey at the temples, but his eyes were the same. Zahir. They treated him in the field once, a wounded scout who'd shown them where the ambush was waiting. He'd been 17 then. She'd wrapped his shoulder and told him to run. He had. He'd made it out. She'd almost convinced herself that meant something. Brooke didn't move toward the room. She didn't run. She stood exactly where she was, hands still holding for tubing, and breathed like she'd been trained to breathe, in for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4. The technique they'd taught her in the mountains when the shelling started. Morrison's voice came next, from the ICU 2 doors down. Quiet. Clear. Not a request. That Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan. She carried me 6 miles through enemy fire when I was 8 years old. The corridor went absolutely still. Not silence, the sound of fluorescent lights humming, of machines beeping, of the world refusing to stop even when it should. One of the nurses whispered something to another. Brooke heard her name spoken like it was a question. Like it was a miracle. An FBI agent emerged from the stairwell with a woman in a Navy uniform carrying a sealed folder. The woman's eyes found Brooke immediately. She walked with the kind of precision that meant rank, that meant authority, that meant she'd been waiting for this moment. "Senior Chief Sullivan," the woman said, extending the folder. "I'm JAG Officer Commander Patricia Mendez. These are declassified operational records from your service in Helmand Province, 2004 to 2006. The Pentagon has authorized full disclosure." She paused, letting the weight of it settle. "Your service record is about to become very public." Brooke took the folder. Her hands didn't shake. That was the thing about 20 years of practice, you learn to hold breaking glass without cutting yourself. The pages inside were stamped, classified, top secret in fading red ink, now crossed through with a single black line, declassified by order of Deputy Secretary of Defense. Operation Mountain Shadow. Operation Corazon Granite. Operation Silent Guardian. Dates, coordinates, casualty counts. Hers. The names of the dead she'd held and the living she'd saved. The village coordinates that had never officially been attacked. The child she'd pulled from burning rubble who was now a captain, sitting in an ICU bed with his lungs finally working without a needle's help. The elevator doors opened. A SEAL team commander in dress blue stepped into the corridor. His bearing was like a physical presence, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst and decided it wouldn't break him. Behind him, more came through, operators in dress uniforms, their movements synchronized like a prayer made flesh. She counted them without trying to. 47. 48. 50. Commander Price, his nameplate read that clearly, stepped forward and looked directly at Brooke. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan, he announced, his voice pitched to carry to the gathering crowd, the Navy Cross. 2 silver stars. He paused between each decoration like it was its own sentence. For Purple Hearts. You held a forward operating base in Helmand Province for 72 consecutive hours with a squad of 8 against an insurgent force estimated at 300 combatants. You evacuated 23 civilians under fire. You performed emergency surgery on the bare ground using field expedient equipment while maintaining defensive positions. You were ordered into deep cover to protect classified assets, and you have maintained your oath of silence for 2 decades. Today, that silence is released. She should have felt something. Relief. Validation. Instead, she felt the weight of the folder grow heavier in her hands, as if all those years of silence were suddenly pressing down at once, demanding to be acknowledged. An FBI agent stepped forward. His badge read Special Agent Morrison, Financial Crimes Division. He looked directly at Dr. Hargrove, who had just emerged from his office and was registering, with the terrible slowness of a man watching his world collapse, exactly what was happening. Dr. Marcus Hargrove, the agent said, producing handcuffs with a smooth, practice motion. You are under arrest for healthcare fraud, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and violations of the False Claims Act. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Hargrove's face went the color of old bone. This is insane. I'm a respected physician. I have board support. My lawyer will. Commander Price cut through the noise without raising his voice. Dr. Hargrove, effective immediately, by order of the Secretary of the Navy and in accordance with federal statute protecting service members from retaliatory employment actions, you are terminated from Sacred Heart Hospital. Your medical privileges are suspended pending federal investigation. You will not treat patients. You will not enter this facility unescorted by law enforcement. Hospital Administrator Karen Wells appeared at the stairwell, her face carefully neutral, flanked by 2 security officers. Dr. Hargrove, I have to inform you that the hospital board voted 40 minutes ago to revoke your contract and cooperate fully with federal investigators. Her voice was the kind of polite that cuts deeper than any scream. Security will escort you from the premises immediately. The cameras arrived next, 2 news crews, already positioned, already rolling. Someone from the Pentagon Public Affairs Office had made a phone call. The narrative was being shaped even as it happened. Hargrove looked at them, then back at Brooke. His eyes held something that might have been regret or might have been rage. She'd stopped trying to distinguish between them in other people's faces years ago. You, he said, pointing. You performed an unauthorized medical procedure. You violated protocol. You. Morrison was standing now. The fur still in his arm, vitals still being monitored, but standing. His voice had the weight of command, the kind of authority that came from having led men in places where hesitation meant death. She saved my life with skills you'll never understand because you never had to learn them. In my world, she outranks everyone in this building. In yours, she just exposed you. The handcuffs went on. They clicked with a sound like finality. Hargrove was marched through the lobby while staff watched in absolute silence. Some of them had worked with him for years. Some had respected him. Others had simply been afraid. As his figure disappeared through the main entrance, with cameras following and security doors sealing behind him, the weight of his absence became suddenly visible. Room opened up. Air moved. The building seemed to breathe. Commander Price turned to Brooke. "Senior Chief, we've located your combat boots. They're evidence no longer." A junior officer, couldn't have been more than 24, with intelligent ops insignia on his sleeve, stepped forward with a plastic bag. Inside were the boots she'd kept in her locker for 20 years. Scuffed. Worn. The left one still had a stain from helm and dust that no amount of washing had ever completely removed. She took them. Her hands closed around the plastic, and something that had been locked inside her for 2 decades released like a pressure valve finally opening. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. But she held those boots like they were the only real thing in a room full of uniforms and protocol and the machinery of recognition finally grinding into motion. Morrison stepped closer. He was pale, still weak, but his eyes were clear. "I never knew your name," he said quietly. "You were just the soldier who wouldn't let me die. Now I know you're the one who never stopped serving. Even when they made you disappear. Even when nobody was watching. You never stopped." Brooke looked at the operators filling the corridor. 50 of them. Maybe more. She recognized some faces, older now, scarred now, but the same soldiers she'd sweated with, bled with, held when the weight of what they'd seen threatened to drown them. They'd all maintained the silence. For 20 years, they'd all kept the secret. They'd all waited for this moment. "I'm going on break," she said finally, her voice steady as a surgical laser. One corner of her mouth tilted up. Not quite a smile. "I need some jello." Morrison laughed, a real laugh, the kind that only comes from surviving what shouldn't be survivable. Around them, the tension began to break. Nurses started moving again. Machines returned to their rhythms. The hospital remembered how to function. That night, Brooke stood in the trauma bay, the same bay where she'd saved Morrison's life just 36 hours before, and looked at the new plaque being installed on the wall. The Sullivan Center for Emergency Medicine. Underneath it, in smaller letters, founded in honor of those who serve in silence. Her combat boots sat in a glass case beside it. If you've made it this far, you know what separates the people who talk about their values from the people who live them. Brooke Sullivan spent 20 years saving lives in a hospital because that's who she was, not because anyone was watching. That's the difference between a job and a calling. Subscribe for more stories about the quiet warriors among us. Leave a comment. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? Like this video and hit that notification bell because next week we're uncovering a story about a former Marine who worked as a school janitor for 14 years. You won't believe what he was actually protecting.